tell the audience what the Hexapla is.
Oh, yes, yes.
Let's even start. What's the Septuagint? You mentioned that a few times, the LXX stuff.
Yes.
And then how do we get the Hexapla out of the Septuagint?
Right. So there are many scholars who would then say that that question requires like a seminar and a multi-lecture series.
So we have the expression Hebrew, standing on one leg.
Yes, yes. So sort of as a legend first, the Septuagint is what's considered kind of, 70. It means 70, right? Septuaginta. You have domekonda in Greek, means the 70, because there's a legend that 70 translators were gathered in Alexandria in 3rd century BCE and translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Now, there was probably something that happened in Alexandria involving whether the Jewish community there or Jews coming in from Judea, Palestine, or some combination of that. And translation work that began there and then continued on for the next, several centuries to complete kind of the whole Bible, and then further revisions after that. But in short, it goes back to, at least at its beginning, probably, Alexandria in Egypt and Jews translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek.
But the short answer is it's the ancient Greek translation of the Torah and then eventually the Tanakh.
Yes, yes.
And then plus a few other things thrown in there. Okay. And then how do we get from that, the original Septuagint, let's call it the Proto-Septuagint, because we don't have that, right? Am I right? I mean, we have
reconstructions of,
we have 3rd century or even 3rd century manuscripts like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus, but we don't have the one from 250 BC or 100 BCE. Maybe fragments of it.
Works of, just like kind of the textual critical endeavor of trying to get back to the earliest retrievable text possible for the Septuagint is, what people would call the Old Greek. But then kind of later versions of it are, that's mostly what we have in manuscripts.
And then what's the Hexapla?
Yeah. So the Hexapla is it's interesting because I think as time has gone on, Origen deserves less and less credit for it. So Origen, he's a church father. Now he, of course, was in charge of the whole project, but I think what the final product was, so this was a work that went on in Caesarea Maritima on the west coast of, ancient Israel in the 3rd century, middle of the 3rd century. Origen began this work. He was kind of the head of a project that said, there's scholarly debate about why exactly he did it, but probably one of the reasons was to get kind of a firm, established Septuagint text, because there were kind of different versions out there, and comparing it with the Hebrew to see how it differed with the Hebrew and kind of be able to mark up where, a text might differ among different communities or it differed from the Hebrew. And so people could know, what was going on, basically, when you compare the Greek and Hebrew Bibles and different versions of the Greek text. So what he did...
And this is the 3rd century CE, right?
Yeah.
So would you say that by the 3rd century, the Greek Septuagint, meaning the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was more fluid than the Hebrew text at the time? Because by this time we have, at least we're told we have, something approximating the Masoretic text, where Rabbi Akiva, a couple centuries before that, or a century before that, is interpreting the difference of whether there's a vav or not a vav, even though it doesn't change pronunciation or meaning, right? So would you say it was more fluid at this time?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose it depends on how you define fluid, and this again is getting a bit out of my area of expertise. But I would say there's definitely significant differences between different communities' versions of the text that were worth sorting through.
And that's what Origen is attributed to have done.
Yeah. So, he definitely was in charge of the project, but what I'm about to talk about is where I think he deserves less credit. And so, what he ended up doing was putting together a giant book, probably 40, 50 volumes on a shelf of 6, because hexapla, right, is, 6-fold. It means 6-fold in Greek. 6 columns, in some places more, but we won't get into that. 6 columns of text, right? In the furthest left column, you had the Hebrew Bible, probably 1 word per line, or sometimes 2 or 3 words per line. In Hebrew characters. This doesn't survive anywhere, but people who have worked on it reconstruct that must have been there, and it's in ancient descriptions of it. People who saw it say there was something there. So I think it's pretty certain it was there. And then the next second column is, matching up to those 1, sometimes 2 or 3 words per line, the same Hebrew words written out in Greek characters instead of Hebrew. And then after that, there were 4 separate Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, one by Aquila, which is probably the closest formally to the Hebrew, and then Symmachos, and then the Septuagint, and then Theodotion. And so many scholars after Origen would use this, at least who, when it was still there. It probably got destroyed a few centuries later after he did it. But
was there only one copy of this?
Probably, yeah. There was probably only ever one copy because it's 40 volumes, right?
Wow.
So it was.
So we don't have the original Hexapla. What we have is what do we have of that?
A lot of. I was describing this to my dad once to illustrate what I was working on, and I was like, it's as if you had one of the most important books in all of history. I mean, 40 volumes on a bookshelf, and then somebody just threw a grenade at it and it exploded, and all these fragments stuck to all sorts of other things. Now we have to try and piece it back together, because that's really what has happened. I mean, I doubt anyone ever copied it in ancient times because it was so huge. It probably sat at Caesarea, and a lot of people did work from it, would come and visit in. I think there was probably a copy of Psalms that circulated more than just in Caesarea, because that's what we find quoted a lot everywhere else. That's what we have in the Geniza here, is we have a page, the oldest page of the Hexapla, of any manuscripts of the Hexapla that remains to this day, is here in Cambridge. And that, to me, I mean, that's from Psalms. The other one, which is...
That's the palimpsest with like the Jerusalem Talmud and one of the poets on it.
And the Piyut on it, and then the undertext is the Hexapla, just very, fragmentary bits of it. And then the other one that we have that survived is in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, and that's Psalms. And then...
Is that also a palimpsest?
That's also a palimpsest,
Wow.
So the two most important texts for this are both palimpsests.
Meaning for the audience, they erased the text of the Hexapla and wrote something else over it because they didn't care about the Hexapla. So these are at least 2 copies just of Psalms.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else do we have?
And then everything else we have, I mean, there's a few others that are those are the 2 most important. There's a few others that kind of maintain something of the columns and are just, I mean, very scattered, right? Between all of these, it's not much more than 1,050 words or so. And then everything else is just little tiny bits of quotations in ancient Greek writings, like in the Church Fathers, in the margins of Septuagint manuscripts, in the Syro-Hexapla, which is a Syriac kind of Bible based on the Hexapla to make one text. I won't get into all the details.
They didn't have 6 columns though in the Syro-Hexapla.
Not 6 columns. It was, well, there's debate about what it was exactly, but it might have been just an annotated kind of Syriac version of the touched up, refined, annotated Septuagint text, but it has a lot of marginal notes to mention differences, and there's some quotations of the Hexapla there, and then just a lot of things in commentaries and things like that. So
in commentaries, they're quoting the parts of the...
Yeah, they'll quote parts of the Hexapla. And I should mention, I was thinking a lot of this from the perspective of the second column, the Hebrew and Greek letters, because that's much more fragmentarily attested. But if you consider all the other translations, we got a lot of that in ancient Greek commentaries on the Bible, where they'll say, and Aquila says this, and Theodotion says this, and Symmachos renders it this way.
And we know or we think they're quoting that from the Hexapla.
Almost certainly,
I mean, there could have been a manuscript of Aquila, right?
Yeah, it's certainly, and so that's definitely possible. But usually when they quote them in groups, they're all together, so you're like, okay, they must have been looking at it. Or quoting somebody who looked at it. And what we find is much of that, I mean, it's a bit easier with the sukunda, the Greek transcriptions.
So tell us what the sukunda is. So the first column is the Hebrew. Well, you kind of did.
Yeah.
The sukunda is the Hebrew written out in Greek characters, right?
Right.
And so we don't have the original except for some Psalms, palimpsests, and so we have...
Well, and that wouldn't be original. It would just be
their
original format.
Well, at least it's... Right. It's at least the original format.
Yeah.
So we have quotations and commentaries, and then we have notations and margins of manuscripts, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so all of that, like for the sukunda, outside of those 2 main palimpsests, the one in Milan and the one here, I mean, it's all just scattered. And so you might have, like in John Chrysostom, an early church father, his works, you might find 50 to 100 words, but they're scattered. So you have to read through his commentary, and there's 1 here. You read through it again, and then there's 2 here.
And then this brings another problem. So John Chrysostom, presumably, if I probably mispronounced that, he's got a bunch of manuscripts of his works too, right?
Oh my goodness.
So how do we deal with that problem?
So I wish I had, when I was working on this, so another thing I have coming out is a critical edition of the sukunda, right? So that's been a big project that is now in the editing, proofing stages. So within the next couple of years, it should be out.
So did you have to track down all the manuscripts of John Chrysostom?
So Chrysostom is the absolute worst because if you could imagine, I went to the library down here to get, so it's a big stack of books about this tall, and that is just the index of the manuscripts for Chrysostom.
Index of the manuscript.
Yeah, the index is about 8 volumes tall.
When you say the index, there's a whole lot of manuscripts is what you're saying.
Right, so it'll say, so it takes this many books to say, now for his work on this, these are the libraries and the list of manuscripts for this work, and that's just the index. Then you have to go and actually find the manuscripts.
So how could you possibly check, like there's too many data points, and then not all of these, well, I mean, so how do you do this?
Well, you get everything you can, right? So for me, so the reason you won't see a lot of critical editions of Chrysostom's work in Greek is because it would be such a nightmare to go through all of that material. But for me, it wasn't so bad because I'm just doing 2 words here or there.
Right.
And so even if there's 20 or 30 manuscripts for the work I'm dealing with, right? Because he wrote so much. So for one book of his, there might be 20, 30 manuscripts. So it's not, when I'm just checking one word in it, you can go through all of those. So yeah, you look at digitizations online. There was one I found in the Wren Library here. I emailed with some monks on a peninsula in Greece to send me
Mount Athos?
Yes, exactly. To send me a CD-ROM of the images, or in other cases, printed out images that they sent in the mail. And so
That's
I have on my library over there a CD-ROM from them. So you gather all this stuff any way you can, and you just document as much as you can. So
that's a monumental work you've undertaken.
Well,
I want to pause here for a minute and just for the audience to appreciate this is a monumental work for you to make a critical edition of the Sukunda, of this Hebrew transcribed into Greek, because like you said, I mean, there's so many different, like it's not just you went to the printed edition of John Chrysostom and said, this is what it says. You tracked down the manuscripts. That's incredible.
Oh, I mean, it definitely took a long time, and it's going to be quite a headache to proof that whole book, which I've just started recently going through the proofing finally. But the most interesting thing, I think, was one of Chrysostom's commentaries is only preserved in Armenian, a portion of the Isaiah commentary, which is where we have a good number of transcriptions. So that, analyzing that meant, doing a historical phonological analysis of how Armenian transcribes Greek, which transcribes Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
So that's probably the most interesting chapter in the book.
Would you say that, presumably this Armenian evidence isn't as robust as things that are still in Greek? Because every time you translate, you potentially, you're maybe lost in translation and then lost in the transmission.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. So there's going to be phonological things that differ, where maybe two sounds in Greek become one in Armenian, and then the transmission thing, and
like maybe there's 2 characters in Armenian. I know nothing about Armenian that look very similar, and there's mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
I needed help for that one, so there's a professor over at King's, Bert Vaugh, who helped me with some of the Armenian stuff. So that's one of the great things about being in Cambridge, is you can get help from experts just down the block. So
that's really monumental. That's amazing.